Hey guys, welcome back to the Path to Growth podcast, where small business owners can learn the ropes when it comes to digital marketing. So today we're going to discuss 5 podcast questions to help break the ice. I know not a lot of people really need this, but for those who do, this will help you if you have a guest on the show and you don't know where to start. We have a couple of pointers here to help you break the ice. It's very simple. So when you first create a new episode on your podcast, you usually discuss the topic, and your topic is in relation to your audience. But the one thing that you sometimes will forget is that not everybody is going to be your audience. You could be discovered, especially with platforms like Anchor and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You could be discovered by people who don't normally listen to your podcast. So what you can do is you can create content through collaborations. And we're going to touch that topic later on. But that's one of the few pointers that that'll help you with growing your podcast through exploration, because Spotify and Anchor and all these platforms, they're search engines. So if someone's searching for a certain person and they happen to be on your podcast, this will benefit you because they don't know who you are. They know who the person is who's on your podcast. And if your topic revolves around that person that they're searching for, they may become a listener. They may become a listener for life because they're like, oh shit, he had what's his name on the episode, and he's my favorite rapper or my favorite fashion model or whatever it is. So the first one we're going to start with is an origin story. This one's pretty simple. So basically you would tell your podcast guest, break down your origin story for the audience. And this could be something from, they came from another country and they moved over here and their roots are really humble. They're humble roots, and that will connect with somebody who also has that same story. And they're going to say, okay, now this person I look up to. And the fact that you had them on your podcast shows the type of character you are. And now you're going to become someone who they listen to because you're exposing these stories to the people listening and to the people who are, again, exploring you through these platforms. Another question that you can ask your podcast guest would be, what would you tell somebody who is just starting out in your field? There's always going to be that guy listening who he asks himself, what do I want to be when I grow up? And he's still deciding. So if the topic you're covering just so happens to be in something that his field is in, he would either consider or not consider that career path based upon what your guest tells them. If it only took 6 months to go to med school, everyone would be a doctor. It doesn't. So that's one of the deciding factors. When people decide, do I want to go through all that work to be a doctor and it's not my passion, or is it my passion and I do want to go through all that work? These are decision factors that make people realize. So just answering a simple question on your podcast would actually convince someone whether or not they want to be in a certain field. Maybe they just started and they're in their first semester of college, and all you have to do is have somebody on the cast who has 25, 30 years of experience in that field. And they say something that might trigger someone to say, you know what, I'm really, really struggling with this, but I think I'm going to hold on because this guy just said this. And that convinced me that I really should pursue this. Or that person might say something that would discourage them. And they might say, I didn't think about that. But the fact that this guy has that experience just so happens to help my decision. It helps people's decision making. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit right from your phone or computer. And you can distribute
everywhere, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You could make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Another interesting question to ask your guests on a podcast is, who would you like to see on my show? And this is really interesting because 2020 was really one of those years. And really it started in 2018, 2019 to really take shape, where there's collaborations in the music industry. I mean, look at someone like Lil Nas X. You know, he literally sent out a tweet and asked Billy Ray Cyrus if he can do a collaboration with him. And he did it. And the kid charted to number one. And I mean, unbelievable. And this is all because of a collaboration. And there's tons of artists right now that are collaborating with other artists that you normally wouldn't think they would collaborate with. And it turns out that each audience segment now has a new audience. So if it's if it's someone like Van Halen and he's collaborating with Jay-Z, those are two totally different audiences that are now colliding, and they might be interested in each other's music now. So that's something you think about, because you might have someone on the podcast that would suggest having someone else on. You know, that would be like someone like Snoop Dogg saying, let's have Martha Stewart on the podcast. When those two collaborated, that was like an explosion. Who would have thought, so that's something that you can do on your podcast, is like have one of those moments where someone on your show who you wouldn't have expected to suggest somebody else, they're collaborating now, and they both could be on your show, or that person might, give a shout out, and that opens up a relationship with those two people who maybe don't have a relationship, but the reason why they do now is because they were referred to on your podcast. If YouTube taught us one thing this year, or last year, I should say, is that education through online is, it's golden. It's pretty much as good as college. So you really have to consider someone being on your podcast. They could be like a tour guide to show someone the ropes. You can ask your guest, hey, listen, I know you don't normally do this, and I know maybe, this is something that should cost a lot of money because it's coming from someone like you who's a leader in your industry. But how do you make a Facebook post like you normally do? And how does yours grow more than this person's? It's almost like having someone like Gary Vaynerchuk on a podcast. He'll have no problem doing that. He loves doing that. So you can ask him, like, what's your strategy for, growing my account to fucking 2,000 followers overnight? And he'll tell you, oh, you got to do this, 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 and this. And somebody might literally explode because of that tip. Someone would pay, $10,000 for a consulting service to get that information. And because it was on your podcast, now your podcast is becoming more reputable because of that. And that's something to really think about, because it could be the littlest piece of information that you normally wouldn't think someone would teach somebody on a podcast, let alone in real life, for free. And that could lead to your podcast exploding. And, you don't have to dig in to have a 1 to 2 hour session. This could just be a 30,000 foot view of what's going on in that industry. Okay, the last question that you could ask someone on your podcast would be, what mistakes did you make during your journey into whatever their industry is? Or what regrets do you have? This is going back to my point for the second question, which is maybe there's regrets that person has. Maybe the career path that they chose leads to you can't really spend that much time with your family, or something like that. If I'm sure if an airplane pilot got on your podcast and he would mention, that's one of the known facts about airplane pilots is, they're away for periods of time, depending on, what routes you have. And that could be the deciding factor that maybe some kid didn't think about. And that, again, that could influence decisions. Your podcast is an influence already. So if you have an influencer on your podcast, an influencer could be anyone. You don't have to be a model on Instagram and have 1 million people to be an influencer. An influencer could be, like I said, an airplane pilot you just so happen to have on your podcast, and he literally influences the decision of someone listening who wants to take that career path, and his mistake or his regret would either help or discourage that person listening from taking that career path. So it's just something to think about, because these little moments that you have on your podcast mean a lot to the people who's listening, because they're listening for a reason, and you or the guest on your podcast could influence that decision for them. Guys, thanks so much for listening in. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or any questions regarding this episode, feel free to reach out to us. Our email address is in the description. It's info@rjmediastudios.com. Talk to you next time. If you feel like this has brought you some value, please join our community by texting podcast to 516-447-5332.